Let me start with something simple. If I say the word Zen, what shows up in your mind? Most people don't think of texts or philosophy. They see someone sitting, a cushion, a straight back, quiet room, maybe a wall, maybe incense if we're being dramatic about it. That image has become so dominant that for a lot of people, Zen just means sitting meditation, and that seems harmless at first. But if you sit with that assumption for a minute, something starts to feel a little off, because now we have to ask, is Zen actually the act of sitting, or did sitting show up inside a much larger tradition, and then slowly take over the entire picture? Those are not the same thing. Now, every discipline has practices. If you're learning music, you practice scales. If you're training for a sport, you run drills. If you're doing science, you run experiments. And in all of those cases, the practice is just a tool. Nobody worships the scale. Nobody builds an identity around running laps. Nobody bows to the microscope. The tool is there to do something. It helps you see something, develop something, understand something. And ideally, at some point, you stop thinking about the tool entirely. It just does its job. Meditation, at least historically, looks a lot like that. It's a way of creating a quiet space where you can actually observe what your mind is doing, not control it, not fix it. Just watch it. Thoughts show up. Feelings show up. Stories start building themselves. And if you're still enough, you can see all of that happening in real time. It's simple, almost boring actually, but it's functional. Now here's where things start to shift. Because human beings have a habit. We do this everywhere, not just in religion. We start with a tool, and then slowly we turn it into something else. We turn it into a symbol. And once something becomes a symbol, it picks up new meanings. It becomes a sign that you're serious, a sign that you're committed, a sign that you belong. And eventually, whether anyone admits it or not, it becomes a sign of status. You can see this pattern very clearly if you look at early Christian monastic life. There were monks who fasted for extreme lengths of time, others who slept on stone floors, some who went as far as physically punishing themselves. Now originally, these were acts of personal devotion, but over time, something subtle crept in. The practices themselves started functioning as proof. The more you endured, the more serious you appeared. And once that happens, comparison shows up almost immediately. Who's more devoted? Who can endure more? Who is really committed? At that point, the practice isn't just a practice anymore. It's a display. Something similar can happen with meditation. Not because people are trying to fake anything. Most of the time, nobody is being dishonest. It's just how groups of humans behave. You put people in a room together, sitting in silence, and everyone is aware of everyone else. You notice who shows up early, who sits perfectly still, who never misses a session, who goes to every retreat. Nobody has to say anything. The structure builds itself, and then quietly the questions start changing. It is no longer just, what am I seeing in my own mind? Now it becomes, how long do you sit? How many retreats have you done? How many years have you been practicing? Again, nothing wrong with those questions on the surface, but they reveal something. The practice has started to carry social meaning. It's no longer just a tool. It's a signal, and signals do what signals always do. They create hierarchy. They create comparison. They create identity. You start to become someone who sits, and not just someone who sits, but someone who sits a lot, or someone who sits correctly, or someone who sits longer than others. And at that point, something very subtle happens. The practice begins to turn outward. It becomes visible, performative, even if nobody calls it that. Now here's the part that's easy to miss. Sitting still for long periods of time is a skill. You can get very good at it. You can train your body, your posture, your breathing. You can become extremely disciplined, but none of that, by itself, guarantees that you're actually seeing anything clearly. Stillness is not the same as insight. Endurance is not the same as understanding. And discipline by itself is not the same as awakening. They can be related, but they're not identical. And yet in some environments, those lines start to blur. The more someone sits, the more they're seen as serious. The more serious they're seen, the more authority they're given. The more authority they have, the more the system reinforces itself. And pretty soon, you're no longer just looking at a practice. You're looking at a structure. And once that structure is in place, something else happens. People begin protecting it, not necessarily because they've examined it deeply, but because their sense of belonging is tied to it. If sitting is the core of the community, then questioning sitting can feel like questioning everything. The group, the teacher, the path, even yourself. So now we come back to the original question. If Zen gets reduced to sitting, what happens to everything else that used to be part of it? The conversations, the direct challenges, the strange, sometimes uncomfortable questioning that cuts through assumptions, the parts that don't look calm or peaceful at all. If all of that disappears, and what's left is just a room full of people sitting very quietly, are we still looking at the same thing, or are we looking at something that resembles it, but functions very differently? That's where we're starting, not by attacking meditation, not by dismissing it, but by asking a very simple question. What is this practice actually doing, and what has it become? Because once you start to see that difference, everything else in this conversation begins to open up. So, if sitting wasn't always the center of everything, how did it become that? Because if you walk into most Western Zen centers today, this is the thing. Sit properly, sit consistently, sit deeply, and somehow in that everything else is contained. Sometimes it's even said very directly. That sitting itself is enlightenment, not leading to it, not preparing for it, but already expressing it. Now that idea doesn't come out of nowhere. It's most often traced back to a single figure, a 13th century Japanese monk named Dōgen. And in modern Zen, especially in Soto lineages, Dōgen is often treated as something close to untouchable. Not officially, of course. Nobody stands up and says this man is infallible. But functionally, that's how he's handled. His words carry a kind of final authority. But here's where things start to get complicated. Not in a dramatic conspiracy way, just in a very quiet historical way. For a long time, much of the Soto tradition operated without heavy reliance on Dōgen's philosophical writings. That alone surprises people, because today he's presented as the central voice, the defining mind, the one who explains what the whole thing is about. But historically, Soto institutions were often focused on very different things: temple administration, ritual structure, community relationships, daily monastic life. The philosophical texts were there, but they weren't always front and center. And then something shifts. In the early to mid-20th century, access to Soto archives begins to open up more widely. Scholars start digging into the material, reading closely, comparing versions, looking at how texts were compiled. And what they find is not a clean, untouched body of work. It's layered, edited, sometimes reorganized, sometimes unclear. Now that's not unusual for pre-modern texts. Nothing back then was sitting in a climate-controlled archive, waiting for future historians. Things were copied by hand, rewritten, expanded, condensed, interpreted. So the issue isn't that there's variation. The issue is how much certainty gets projected backward onto something that is historically a bit messy. Take a text like Bendowa. It's often presented as this foundational explanation of Zazen, clear, direct, authoritative, and it contains that powerful idea that practice and enlightenment are not two separate things, that when you sit, you are not moving toward awakening. You are already expressing it. Now that's a very compelling idea. You can feel the pull of it immediately. It removes striving. It removes doubt. It turns the act of sitting into something complete in itself. But when scholars started looking more closely at texts like this, questions started to appear about how the text was compiled, about how it was transmitted, about whether what we're reading now is exactly what was originally written. Some suggest later editing. Some defend the traditional view. The point isn't to settle the argument here. The point is something simpler. The historical ground is not as solid as people assume. And here's where it gets more interesting. Even if we set aside questions about specific texts, there's a broader pattern. The version of Dōgen that most people encounter today is not just the medieval monk. It's also the result of modern interpretation, modern scholarship, and modern institutions deciding which parts matter most. So what we're often receiving is not just Dōgen. It's Dōgen filtered through the 20th century, then presented as timeless truth. And that filtering process shapes everything. Now bring that back to Zazen, because this is where the shift really becomes visible. In earlier Chan traditions in China, meditation was present, important even. But it existed alongside a whole range of other methods. Direct questioning, koans, sharp exchanges between teacher and student, sometimes confrontational, sometimes confusing, often anything but calm. There are even warnings in those traditions. Warnings about becoming attached to stillness. Warnings about mistaking quiet mind for realization. Warnings about turning meditation into a kind of comfort zone. But in the modern presentation, especially in the West, those warnings don't always come through as strongly. What comes through is the posture, the cushion, the instruction to sit, and sometimes the idea that sitting itself is the realization. And now if you step back and look at the whole picture, something starts to take shape. You have a historical figure whose writings are complex and not entirely straightforward. You have institutions that, over time, organize themselves around certain practices. You have modern scholarship that elevates specific interpretations. And you have Western audiences looking for something simple, direct, and experiential. Put all of that together, and you get a very clean message. Just sit. It's elegant. It's appealing. It's easy to transmit. But the simplicity can hide the complexity that produced it. And once that simplicity becomes central, it begins to reshape everything around it. The structure of the community, the authority of the teacher, the identity of the practitioner, the definition of the path itself. So now we have to ask another uncomfortable question. If the central practice of a tradition is shaped as much by historical development, institutional needs, and modern interpretation as it is by original intent, then what exactly are we practicing? Are we engaging in something ancient and unchanged, or something that has been assembled, emphasized, and refined over time until it feels ancient? And more importantly, what happens when that practice becomes the foundation of authority? Because that's where the conversation starts to move out of history and into something much closer to lived experience. So, if we take what we've looked at so far, a practice that began as a tool, a history that's more complex than it first appears, and a modern system that centers itself around a single form, something else starts to emerge. Not immediately, not obviously, but steadily. Because once a practice becomes central, people begin organizing themselves around it. And when people organize around something, identity starts to form. At first, it's very light, almost invisible. You just start thinking of yourself as someone who practices, someone who sits. That seems harmless enough, even helpful. But over time, that identity begins to deepen. You're not just someone who sits, you're someone who sits regularly, then someone who sits seriously, then someone who sits more than most people, and without anyone announcing it, a kind of quiet structure begins to take shape. Not written down, not formally declared, but very real. You notice who shows up early, who stays late, who never misses a session, who signs up for every retreat, who can sit without moving, who looks composed. And again, nobody has to say anything, but meaning starts attaching itself to those behaviors. Consistency becomes sincerity, endurance becomes depth, stillness becomes understanding. Now sometimes those things do overlap, but not always. And that not always is where things start to drift. Because once identity is tied to practice, practice stops being neutral. It becomes something you have to maintain, something you protect, something you display, even if subtly. You start to care how it looks, even if you don't admit that to yourself. And then something even more interesting happens. The group begins to reflect that structure back to you. The people who sit the most are often treated as the most committed. The most committed are often given the most responsibility, and those with the most responsibility gradually move closer to authority. Again, no conspiracy, no master plan, just a very natural progression. But now we've crossed a threshold, because practice is no longer just something you do. It's something that determines where you stand. And once that happens, a second layer forms, authority. In many Zen centers, authority doesn't come from debate. It doesn't come from open questioning. It doesn't even always come from clear demonstration of insight. It often comes from recognition within the structure, from the teacher, from the lineage, from the institution itself. And that authority is usually expressed quietly, through titles, through roles, through who is allowed to teach, who is allowed to correct others, and who is allowed to interpret the practice. Now here's where things tighten, because once authority is linked to practice, questioning the authority can feel like questioning the practice itself. And if the practice has already become part of your identity, that question can feel very personal. So what tends to happen, not always, but often enough to notice, questions soften, doubts get pushed aside, concerns are reframed, and language begins to shift. Instead of direct disagreement, you hear things like, trust the process, stay with the practice, don't get caught in thinking. On the surface, those sound like reasonable instructions, and sometimes they are. But in certain contexts, they can also function as a kind of smoothing mechanism. They reduce friction, they discourage disruption, they keep the structure stable, and stability for an institution is very valuable. Now add one more element, emotional investment, because people don't just sit. They give time, energy, attention, years of their life. They build relationships. They build identity. They build a sense of meaning around the practice. So if something starts to feel off, if something doesn't quite line up, there's a strong pull to resolve that tension internally, to assume, it must be me. I'm not seeing clearly yet. I need to practice more. And again, sometimes that's true, but sometimes it isn't. And when that uncertainty isn't allowed to be examined openly, it doesn't disappear. It just goes quiet. Now step back and look at the full structure. You have a practice that has become central, a community organized around that practice, an identity built through participation, authority emerging from within that structure, and mechanisms, subtle ones, that maintain stability. That combination is very powerful. It can support deep work. It can create discipline. It can provide continuity. But it also creates conditions where misunderstanding can persist, pressure can build, and in some cases boundaries can blur. Not because anyone set out to create that, but because the structure allows it. And this is not unique to Zen. You see the same pattern in many places. Religious groups, therapeutic communities, even corporate environments. Anywhere a practice becomes identity, and identity becomes tied to authority, you start to see the same dynamics. So the question is not, is Zazen good or bad? That's too simple. The question is, What happens when a practice that was meant to illuminate the mind becomes the foundation of identity and the structure of authority at the same time? Because once those layers stack together, the practice is no longer just a practice. It's a system. And systems have their own behavior. So, let's take everything we've looked at so far. A practice that becomes central. An identity built around that practice. A structure that organizes itself around consistency, discipline, and participation. An authority that emerges from within that structure. Now we ask a different question. What happens when that authority is no longer easily questioned? Because this is where something shifts. And it doesn't look dramatic when it happens. There's no announcement, no moment where someone says, "From now on, don't question anything." It's quieter than that. It shows up in small ways. Who speaks freely and who doesn't? What kinds of questions are welcomed and which ones are gently redirected? What gets discussed openly and what gets handled privately? And over time, a pattern forms. Certain questions begin to feel inappropriate, not because they've been answered, but because they don't fit the tone of the room. If someone asks directly, "Is this practice actually doing what we think it's doing?" that question can land strangely. If someone asks, "Why is this teacher treated as if they can't be wrong?" that question carries weight. And if someone asks, "Why does this feel more like obedience than inquiry?" Now the room really shifts, because those questions don't just examine the practice. They examine the structure, and structures don't like being examined from the inside. So what happens instead? The system adapts, not consciously, not maliciously, just effectively. Language begins to absorb the tension. Trust the teacher. Stay with the practice. Don't get caught in doubt. Your resistance is part of the path. Again, these phrases can be meaningful in the right context, but in a different context, they do something else. They redirect attention away from the structure and back onto the individual. So if something feels off, the first place you look is yourself, not the teacher, not the system, not the dynamics of authority. You. And this is where something very subtle and very powerful takes hold. Because now the system doesn't need to silence people. People begin to silence themselves. They hesitate. They second guess. They reinterpret their own experience to fit what's expected. And over time, that becomes normal. Now add one more layer. Proximity to authority. In many communities, being close to the teacher carries meaning. Not just structurally, but emotionally. It feels like recognition, validation, progress. And because of that, there's a natural tendency to protect that relationship, to not disrupt it, to not question it too directly, to not risk losing it. Again, no one has to enforce this. It happens on its own. Now step back again. Look at the full configuration. A central practice that defines the group. An identity built through participation. Authority tied to that practice. Language that redirects doubt inward, and emotional investment in proximity to that authority. That combination creates something very specific. It creates a system where authority becomes insulated, not absolutely, not perfectly, enough that problems can exist without being clearly named, enough that behavior can cross lines without immediate challenge, enough that discomfort can be explained away as part of the path. And this is where the conversation gets uncomfortable, because now we're not talking about abstract structure anymore. We're talking about lived experience, about what happens when boundaries blur, when authority goes unchecked, when students defer not just to instruction, and in that environment a strange inversion can occur. The very qualities that are meant to support clarity, trust, openness, surrender of fixed views, can be used to bypass clarity entirely. Trust becomes compliance. Openness becomes vulnerability without protection. Letting go becomes not questioning. And from the outside, everything can still look calm, ordered, peaceful. People sitting quietly, following the schedule. But structure doesn't always reveal itself through noise. Sometimes it reveals itself through what isn't being said. So here is the question, and this is the one that tends to land. If a system teaches you to distrust your own doubt, to reinterpret your own discomfort, and to defer to authority in the name of practice, then at what point does that stop being a path of inquiry and start becoming something else? Because Zen, at least in its older expressions, was not gentle about this. It didn't ask you to suppress doubt. It used doubt. It sharpened it. It turned it into a blade. But in some modern structures, that blade gets wrapped in cloth, safer, softer, less disruptive, and also less capable of cutting through anything real. So the question is not whether authority exists. Of course it does. Every tradition has it. The question is whether that authority can be seen clearly, questioned directly, and held within the same field of inquiry as everything else, or whether it sits just outside that field, untouched. Because whatever sits outside inquiry quietly becomes something else. That's your turning point. No yelling, no accusations, just clarity sharp enough that people can't quite unsee it. So after all of that, after looking at the practice, the history, the structure, the authority, there's a natural question that starts to come up. If all of this is so layered, so shaped by history, by institutions, by interpretation, then what's left? Because it can start to feel like everything has been reduced to structure. Practice becomes performance. Authority becomes insulated. Language becomes a kind of smoothing tool. And at that point, it's very easy for the whole thing to collapse into one conclusion. That's it then. There's nothing here. But that doesn't quite hold. Because underneath all of this, there was something that led people to this in the first place. Not the institution, not the posture, not the hierarchy. Something much simpler. The direct experience of being aware, not as an idea, not as a belief, not as something described in a text. Just this, the fact that thoughts appear, that they move, that they dissolve, that the sense of me shifts depending on what's being believed in any given moment. That restlessness shows up. That stillness shows up. That clarity appears sometimes without effort, and confusion appears just as easily. None of that requires a structure. It doesn't require a teacher. It doesn't require a schedule. It doesn't even require a cushion. Those things can support it. They can create conditions where it's easier to notice. But they don't produce it. And that distinction matters. Because once you see that clearly, something very quiet happens. The weight of the structure begins to loosen. Not because you reject it, not because you fight against it, but because you see what it can't actually hold. A posture can't contain awareness. A schedule can't produce understanding. An authority can't grant clarity. At best, they can point. At worst, they can distract. And sometimes, they can do both at the same time. If you go back to some of the earlier expressions of Zen, before everything became so formalized, there's a different tone. Less emphasis on maintaining a form. More emphasis on direct seeing. Conversations that cut through assumptions. Questions that don't let you settle. Moments that interrupt the comfortable narrative about what's happening. Not always calm, not always orderly, but very direct. And that directness doesn't belong to any structure. It doesn't belong to Soto. It doesn't belong to Rinzai. It doesn't belong to any institution at all. It shows up wherever someone actually looks. So the question shifts again. Not, is Zazen correct? Not, is this teacher legitimate? Not even, is this tradition authentic? But something much simpler. What is actually happening right now, before any interpretation? And can that be seen without leaning on a structure to explain it? Because if it can, then something becomes very clear. The practice was never the thing. It was a doorway. And like most doorways, It becomes a problem if you start building your life around standing in it. Some people will keep standing there, refining the posture, perfecting the form, spending years adjusting themselves inside the doorway. That's fine. But others, at some point, notice that the doorway was never the destination, and they step through. Nothing dramatic happens when they do. No special light, no confirmation, no title, just the absence of something that used to feel necessary, and the strange realization that what they were looking for wasn't actually hidden. It was just unnoticed. And once that's seen, the entire structure can still exist. But it no longer carries the same weight, because you're no longer trying to get something from it that it was never able to give in the first place.